We now welcome on a very special guest to Until Saturday. You probably know him as Bill C. He does have a last name. It is Connelly, the great Bill Connelly, one-time candidate for commissioner of college football.
I never withdrew, by the way, just for the record. I've never withdrawn my candidacy. So
yeah,
just for the record.
I would vote for you. You and Nick Saban, one and two. How about that?
Who would win?
Bill, thanks for coming on. We wanted to have you on. You do these returning production numbers every year that are always really interesting. And basically, it's like returning starters only tell you so much, and returning production goes a little bit deeper. It used to be pretty easy to calculate. Now, it's changed a little bit. Rosters are a little bit different. Can you sort of explain what that calculation looks like and what it means?
Yeah, I mean, basically, I'm trying to remember. I think 2014 was the first year I did this. I had my little preview spreadsheets for my preview series, and I started realizing, well, if I just added a couple columns over here, I can start to, percentage of passing yards, returning, all this other stuff. And I started to figure out, like, okay, I have all these percentages now. What does it say? Like, what combination of these things is the most predictive for how you're going to improve or regress the next year? And by the way, that is right out of the gate a very important thing. You see your team in the top 10, it doesn't mean you're going to be good. It just means you're probably going to be better. And that's a very key distinction there. Just because Kennesaw State's 5, no offense to Jason Kirk, but that probably doesn't mean they're a national title contender. It just means they're going to improve. So, but anyway, I mean, I tinker with these every year, and it's just kind of whatever combination of snap counts and yardage and everything else seems to predict improvement or regression the best. And with the portal now, that has been it previously when in the early days when you had like 3 transfers coming in, I was able to pretty easily just kind of take the players' production at the old school and cram it into the new school's production, and on we went. And that's still what I do. It still works relatively well. I'm hoping to be able to at some point start playing with splitting out returning versus incoming production, because that's basically what I measure right now is both. And, we'll see, but it's still relatively predictive as a general rule if you clear a certain bar. Most interesting thing for this season so far is like one team clears the bar, like 80% or higher usually means you're going to improve for, like, most likely. Clemson's the only team in the country that hits that mark right now. Everybody's averages are down, and that's really interesting, in and of itself.
Yeah, people can check out the whole list and all the information on ESPN, ESPN Plus. Bill does a great job there. He did it at SB Nation before. If you've ever seen the SP Plus advanced rating system, Bill's the guy who does that.
That's right.
He's been a football analytics guy long before any of us knew what any of that meant. And you kind of went into my next question, which was, does returning production actually matter? Because we hear about it a lot. We hear about returning starters. But if you're returning a lot of players from a bad team, it's not always a good thing necessarily. So you're saying 80% typically has been the threshold. Do we feel like that has to kind of change because of the new roster situation?
It hasn't really yet. Granted, Oklahoma State single-handedly tried to screw up all the averages last year by returning almost everybody and stinking. But no, I mean, in general, the trends
win someday.
In general, the trends are still there. Basically, if you're over 70%, you're likely to improve. If you're over 80%, you're almost guaranteed to improve, but not quite guaranteed. Virginia Tech was another one last year that I think they did improve, and then their quarterback and running back got hurt, and that stopped everything. But that is that's always the key. Just because your team's up there, it doesn't mean everything's awesome. It just means you have enough continuity, or I guess in this case, just volume of stats that you are more likely to get better than get worse. And if the teams at the bottom, especially like Air Force had one of the lowest averages ever last year, and I was like, they have a pretty high floor typically. How far can they fall? Turns out they can fall really far. Yeah. So, that's bad news, especially I think for Northern Illinois this year. They're kind of bringing up the rear right now in this measure. But it does seem to still connect. Like I said, I'm really curious if I'm able to. It's an intimidating thought having to go back to the last 3 years and start piecing together what was returning versus incoming, and changing my spreadsheets. I hate changing my spreadsheets, but. Generally, like, I'm curious what that says, but in general, you're more likely to improve when you have a lot of guys who did stuff last year.
You mentioned Clemson. They're number 1 this year. They're the only team that clears that 80% bar. Should Clemson fans be booking tickets to the title game, just making reservations and just take up residence there?
I mean, I personally wouldn't. I am this is a really interesting little thought experiment for Clemson, though, because they have been, for the last 4 years now, they've been good, but they obviously haven't been what they were from 15 to 20. And now we get to find out, like, you've got your quarterback. Suddenly you have big play receivers again. You've got more experience than you typically have. Like, what is your ceiling now? Is it merely top 10? Could you be a top 5 team again? I don't completely know the answer. I kind of lean top 10 if we're being honest. But the big plays we saw in the passing game against Texas, if the defense improves, which it'll be good, but again, hasn't been in a lead in a while, then yeah, you can kind of talk yourself into them. I just don't know. I think what Mark Schlabach in our way too early had him like 6th or 7th, I think. That felt like a couple spots too high for me, but I understand the logic at least.
Arizona State is number 2, but they lost Cam Skattebo, who was a pretty big name to lose. They bring in Kanye Udo, the running back from Army. What do you think of the Sun Devils and where they're at? They brought in some portal guys last year. It's worked out. You bring a ton back from a playoff team. The expectations are going to be really high. I mean the returning production in year 4
3?
now for Kenny Dillingham?
3.
Yeah, year 3 for Kenny Dillingham. What do you think about them?
Yeah, I mean, they really do. I mean, Levitt's back. Jordan Tyson, their one-man receiving core is back. You have like a 4 linemen plus a Texas State transfer back up front. Good percentage of the defense. It all makes sense. They and Illinois are super interesting to me this year because both teams could get better while their record gets worse. They were both too good in close games. I think Arizona State was 4-1 in Big 12 play and 1-score games. They became like genuinely awesome the last few games of the year, but until then they were kind of lucky to be where they were. And so now, you lose your identity guy. These returning production, every time I kind of recalculate the numbers in the offseason, the importance of the running back returning gets lower. Like with each amount of better data I have or whatever. So you see in the returning production top 10, you've got the team that just lost Skattebo, the team that just lost Taj Brooks, the team that just lost Ashton Gentil, all in the top 10. They all lose their identity guy, but they return everybody else. And so I do think they're going to have a chance to be really good, just like Illinois will, but you're going to lose close games at some point too, and that's going to hurt Arizona State's going to be in the contender pack, but I'm not going to name them the favorite. They're like 8 favorites in the Big 12 every year.
Yeah, every Big 12 game. I went back and looked at the data. Every single game played in the Big 12 last year was a 1-score game. Actually,
pretty much.
They got 4 teams in your top 12. Last year, kind of a weird year for the Big 12, where again there wasn't a lot of easy wins, but there wasn't a lot of teams that terrified you. But when you look at them and their returning production, what does that mean for the league this season?
I think it means kind of what it meant last year, too. I think they led the nation in average returning production last year as well, and different combination of teams. But, as a spoiler, I've got my SP Plus projections, I think, coming out Thursday. And there are, 8 teams between 19th and 36th. Not high, but 8 teams crammed together. And so it's going to be the same situation it was last year, where it's a better conference than the ACC, but the ACC is going to have all the playoff contenders, or all but one of the playoff contenders, I guess. So I really do Big 12 super reliable in this regard. They're gonna dip into the portal quite a bit. They're gonna lose some guys to the Big 10 and ACC. They're gonna, everybody's gonna dip. Obviously, Tech's trying to go all in here. A lot of teams could be really, really solid, and probably no one's going to be better than anybody else, and it's going to be whoever went 4-1 in 1-score games. That's the team that ends up winning. So battle tested. They're going to know how to win. We saw Arizona State nearly, once it was close, they made a lot of good plays late in that Texas game. But it is going to be hard for one to stand out still.
Texas Tech is rising quickly up the list of the most fascinating teams in the country coming back this year. Everybody wants to talk about the 10 million number, but let's talk about the numbers behind that number. When you looked at what they brought in and their portal haul, regardless of what they paid for it, what do you make of what Texas Tech is adding to the roster that was good enough to make James Blanchard stiff arm Notre Dame as bad as Eddie Lacy did?
Yeah, I think I just kind of, when I'm obviously I have my own opinions on guys as I'm plugging them into the spreadsheet, but also, I'm kind of looking at the stats as I'm doing it I have a bar for, like 5.5 yards per carry. You're pretty good running back. 2 yards per route run. You're a good receiver. Well, Quentin Joyner at USC averaged 7.5 yards a carry last year. Reggie Virgil from Miami, Ohio was at 2.2 yards a route. Terrence Carter from Louisiana is 2.4. Like, they clear all the bars here. At least one of the linemen they brought in has really good block, blown block rates or whatever you want to say. They have havoc creators. It was very stats friendly, the guys they brought in. The question is, how much ground can they make up? Because they're 54th in SP Plus last year. It was very Texas Tech. The offense was solid. Defense wasn't. Like, how much talent wise, they're obviously going to be improved, but they're, 3 brand new potential starting defensive linemen and a brand new secondary to go with like 2 guys from last year. So I don't really know what the ceiling's definitely higher, but I'm not willing right out of the gate to say they have a higher ceiling than Kansas State or TCU or Arizona State, obviously. But they've entered the pack, the giant pack of contenders. They've at least entered that, I would say.
Illinois is an interesting team. They're coming off a big season. They won 10 games, top 16 ranking, beat South Carolina. They're number 3 in returning production. But they're also in that spot like Arizona State. I think they went 5-1 in one-score games, including South Carolina. Rutgers, they had the field goal miss, but the timeout gave them the chance to win that game. They had to go overtime to beat Purdue and stop a 2-point conversion. But you're bringing back Altmaier and a bunch of really good players. What do you think of the Illini? And is there a situation where, like, yes, you got lucky a year ago, but maybe you can still be good without having to be lucky because everybody's coming back?
Yeah, I'd like to think that Illinois is a team that, when I'm talking about, but kind of teams, that it's a pretty good example of, yes, they won 10 games. It was awesome. If I was an Illinois fan, I would have loved how everything played out. But you understand the recipe you followed to get to 10 wins, with the 2 overtime wins, with the ridiculous end of the Rutgers game, giving up like half of Purdue's points for the season and barely holding on, but winning.
49, yep.
Yeah, like I would like to think that people would understand, like, that's probably not the easiest recipe to replicate from year to year. But like I said, this is probably a team that the record gets worse, but they get better. I mean, because they do. They return Altmaier. Receiving core, I mean, Pat Bryant was a really special receiver, especially for Illinois, in terms of his big play capabilities. They brought in a couple guys who kind of clear that same bar in terms of big plays. Bowick from Ball State averaged like 19 yards a catch or something like that. So maybe, maybe something's there. The offensive line is very much there. The defense should be okay, except up front. They do lose a little up front. But no, on paper, they're absolutely going to be a better team than they were last year. That just doesn't mean they're going to get better than 10 wins.
I think last year I called Illinois the best team in the country that nobody ever thought was actually good. Right. And when people were talking about like the playoff conversation, it was all centered around Illinois. I mean, all centered around Ole Miss and Alabama and all these teams. It's like Illinois, it doesn't really pass the eye test, and nobody's scared of them. But like if you look at resume, like they're as good as anybody else. What did you make of their season last year, and how that relates to what that means on a sheet of paper?
Yeah, I mean, the sheet of paper, first of all, said they were the 31st best team in the country. Like that,
yeah,
that's
where
I
start.
Said
too.
Yeah, I mean that's where I start. They're another team that more often than not overachieved against projections down the stretch. Like most of those close wins came at least a little bit earlier. I guess I don't really count the Northwest. It was only 10 points, but they weren't really scared in that game, I don't think. But they overachieved projections, I guess, in 3 of their last 4 games. Offense did for the last 4 games straight. So that was certainly a good sign, especially if you then take this team that improved late and you keep most of it. So that's all good. But yeah, I mean, they were, until that late stretch where they were where they were overachieving, they were 54th heading into the Michigan State game, 61st actually heading into Minnesota. So they were a very mediocre team until they improved late. And yeah, you just have to hope that that whatever little groove you found there, especially getting your defense back against South Carolina too. Again, I do think that'll turn them into a better team. They're just not going to win all those close games again.
Brett Bielema, I think late in the season, tweeted out my 134 rankings because he liked where I had them. My rankings they're not subjective, but it's me just myself trying to evaluate a resume, you do your SP plus, you've got a whole lot more data and information that goes into that. Do you ever have coaches like reach out like mad at you because of where they are in SP plus?
So one thing I have definitely learned is that special teams coaches notice my ratings because there aren't a lot of special teams ratings out there.
There are not.
Interesting.
So if a coach is catching hell because from his head coach because we only rank 78th or whatever, they're going to notice. Beyond that, I don't know. I mean, I know some who definitely pay attention. They probably don't take if they has them if SP Plus has them low, I'm sure they use it as motivation material or whatever. But generally speaking, I don't think too many of them take them that seriously outside of the special teams realm.
Yeah, some coaches rankings, it's like a whole thing to them. And when you're in the playoff mix, I get it. But different coaches. Brett Bielema reads everything and tweets everything, and yeah.
It goes down in the DMs, is what I'm told.
Yeah.
That's what I'm told.
One of the most interesting teams. You had a really long thread on Blue Sky a couple weeks ago that I liked. You were just kind of sharing random thoughts you were having about teams as you were putting this together. And one of them that stuck out to you and to me is Boise State.
Yep.
They're coming off a playoff appearance. They're bringing back a ton. I don't remember exactly where they rank, but pretty high. But they're also losing one of the greatest running backs in the history of college football.
Yeah. They're
also losing a pretty good receiver. What do you think of that and how that can play out? Because you and I'm pretty high on them for next year for a reason I'll get to in a second. But you mentioned that running back value being less and less.
Yeah.
Is that kind of part of it, you think, with Boise? They continually just produce dudes.
Right. I mean, they are kind of the most well-suited among the G5 in terms of development, in terms of NIL spending. Not that they have a ridiculous amount, but they have money. And obviously they pulled enough together to keep the best running back in the country on their roster. So yeah, this really does kind of, I think my line in the Blue Sky thread was basically like this whole, the concept of returning production. What does it actually mean? In this case, we'll learn quite a bit because they lost the best workhorse in the country, guy who had 2,600 rushing yards, plus
2,600 yards.
Receiving yards as well. He was their big play threat for the most part. Cam Camper had some moments too, but for the most part, if a big play was happening, it was going to be one guy, and he's gone. So how do they rank that high? Because they returned Maddox Madsen, first of all. I thought he played mostly well in the playoff game against Penn State. A couple of mistakes, obviously, but I thought Penn State really wanted him to make plays, and he made some, after, in the second and third quarters especially. But they have 4 starters returning on the offensive line, for whatever that's worth, plus an Ohio State, a blue chip or nearly blue chip Ohio State transfer coming in. The defense, the secondary looks very good on paper. The linebacking core looks good. They had 2 great pass rushers and they lost one of them, but they returned the other. Bring in Malachi Williams, an Idaho pass rusher who looks pretty good on paper. Virgin Morgan's back. Like, they just have a lot of dudes, especially for the G5. So I think, another spoiler for SP Plus, they're 10.5 points ahead of UNLV in the Mountain West. And UNLV is like 4.5 points ahead of anybody else in the Mountain West. So they are going to be heavy projected favorites in every single game. They play except at Notre Dame. Obviously, that's the big one.
Yes. What is interesting, too, about Boise, the reason I'm high on them is actually it's a returning guy who barely played, and it's Sire Gaines, the running back, who has an unbelievable name, and he's a true freshman who looks like he's like 35 years old. And he has a big first game against Georgia Southern, and then he gets hurt, like I think in the Oregon game, and he never came back. Yeah. That's another thing that's kind of probably hard for you to calculating returning production because he didn't put up a ton, but in the little that he played, he did produce a lot.
Yeah,
you had some thoughts on him. I think I replied to you on Blue Sky, and you had some thoughts on him too.
Yeah, if it's a guy who's like a junior, or he was a junior last year, he played 2 games, I can go in and plug his sophomore year stats in and use that as the returning production number. But obviously with Sire Gaines, he's played, I guess, 3. I'm looking at 3 games ever. He had 12 carries against Georgia Southern, 6 against Oregon, 2 against Portland State, and that was it. He averaged almost 8 yards per carry in those 20 carries. He looked spectacular. It was like a couple of the rushes against Georgia Southern. I thought it was Ashton Gentil doing it. So like I don't want to overreact to 20 carries, but he looked spectacular. The other, they brought in Malik Sherrod from Fresno State, whose stats aren't nearly as good, but who's just a veteran, if nothing else. And then Dubar, the other guy, had some carries, didn't do much with him. Dylan Riley did a good amount, and Sire Gaines was very tantalizing. So you do figure nobody's going to do, you just hope to replace, your workhorses or yards in the aggregate more than anything. Nobody's going to rush for 2,600 yards last year, but I think we see a lot of upside with the guys who come back.
Bill, as I continue my part-time living in Boulder, Colorado, I'm contractually obligated to ask you about the Buffs. When you were doing this in 2023, did calculating their data set your computer on fire? And what do you make of them now, where you don't have Shedeur Sanders, you don't have Travis Hunter, but in terms of how they put together a roster, it's way more traditional. It's like 50% transfers, 50% high school kids, and a lot coming back outside of those guys.
Yeah, and I thought it was interesting too. I mean, almost every single transfer they brought in was a senior. They know what they lost from a general experience and leadership perspective, and they were trying to recreate that in the aggregate a little bit. I guess there's a sophomore receiver from Tulsa who might be pretty good. But no, I mean, it is definitely 18 to 20 transfers, I think, which is almost the average now. It was funny. A couple of years ago, I definitely spent way too much of the 23 offseason thinking about how the heck I'm going to handle a Colorado when, 2 years earlier, 10 transfers was a lot, and then 25 transfers was a lot, and then suddenly you had 50. And so that is actually where I kind of changed the SP Plus projections a little bit to account for the recruiting rankings piece of transfers as well. 247 does a pretty good job with that. I obviously have the old recruiting rankings from when they were in high school. So I was able to kind of piece together two different areas where transfers would play a role. And honestly, obviously when they started 3-0 the next season, I was well, blew that. But it turned out it almost nailed Colorado completely. Had them 80th, they finished 84th, something like that. It didn't have them improve. It had them improving last year, but not as much as they did. But no, it does feel like they're at least becoming a little less outlandish in what they do. They brought in a veteran quarterback who's got some yards in his resume in Caden Salter from Liberty. And the defense they brought in 2 or 3 guys for each unit. It all kind of makes sense. I don't know if it's going to be good enough because, whoever wins the Big 12 will be a top 15-ish kind of caliber team. And they just lost 2 of the 10 or 15 best players in the country. So, I don't know if the upside will be the same, but it makes sense. They're going to be decent at the very least.
So I'm hearing is if you're mad at your returning production rankings, then you should send your angry tweets to Dion, not you. Is that accurate?
That's fine.
Okay.
Send them anywhere you want except to me.
So wrapping up this part, by the time this comes out, SP Plus will have already come out. So are there 2 or 3 teams you think are in store for a pretty big jump? I know you're pretty high on Minnesota's defense in particular.
Right.
Are there a handful of teams that, as you put that together, these are the teams I'm looking at to kind of make that jump?
Well, I think what's really interesting to me with what I first spit out here, like I said, hopefully I've got some changes to make by the May update for SP Plus. But what was most interesting to me is you look at the top of the rankings, nothing's going to be a surprise. Well, actually, no. Number 2 is going to be a surprise. I guess if this is already out, I can go ahead and say it's freaking Alabama, which pisses me off, if we're being honest.
Wow.
Because I won't get yelled about that at all. But,
no, you won't.
But basically, SP Plus liked them a decent amount last year still. I thought both the Vandy and Michigan games were extremely fluky. Just from a stat standpoint, the game produced these stats, Alabama usually wins, but they didn't, that kind of thing. And then...
Which I think is important. Sometimes people will always get mad at you and the data is hard to sometimes explain or they don't know it. Yeah. That's an example of something that I think explains it. Yes, Alabama lost these games, but on the whole... when the game plays out this way, they usually win, and they just didn't in these cases. Right. And that's where kind of probability and stuff comes in.
You think about everything it took for Vanderbilt to win. They had a couple of good, really nice offensive drives. They had a deflected pass that just floated in the air perfectly for a defender to catch it on the run and take it in for an easy 7. Everything that had to happen there, right down to the fumble recovery that set up, I think, the game winning points. Like that was a hard recipe to follow. And Alabama had a far better success rate, more big plays, all the things that usually win a game. They had them. They just they were like 4 plays that Vanderbilt won that completely flipped the game around, and that's not a sustainable thing. So yeah, it basically saw them as a team that was really kind of a 2-loss team that accidentally won or lost 4 instead. And now they returned a ton. They rank really high in returning production, considering they don't have their quarterback back, like 27th. Alabama's never ranked 27th in returning production. Still have the recruits, and so voila, they're number 2, and I hate it. But the most interesting thing to me overall isn't necessarily the teams or where they are. Like Ohio State's number 1, shocking. Penn State's up there. Georgia, Notre Dame are up there. But the distance between like number 2 and number 16 is quite a bit smaller than it was just a couple of years ago, because it does feel this year, 5 of last year's top 7 in SP Plus are in the hundreds in returning production right now. But A&M is very high, and Clemson's very high, and Florida's pretty high, Oklahoma's high, Illinois, obviously, Auburn. So basically like the second tier and the first tier are kind of closer together this year than they typically are. And so, you think back to kind of the nutty games that we had in the first half of last season, the table's kind of set for another year like that, I think, which is really one of the main things I ask for. Is like, I just want unpredictable things to happen, and sure seems like they will again.
I'm curious to get your thoughts on this, Bill, because I don't know about the second Georgia team, maybe not quite as dominant, but pretty dominant still. But the last couple of years, and I think looking ahead to this year, you look at this national championship game, 2 teams with horrific losses on their resume. You ask 10 people who cover the sport who should be the preseason number 1, you might get 3 or 4 different answers. You mentioned that gap between number 2 and number 16 is smaller than it has been. Why do you think that is, when you look at why there seems to be more parity at the top of the sport and fewer teams that just like seem like they're playing 3 games a year that they could theoretically lose?
Yeah, I think my old SB Nation colleague Bud Elliott, now at CBS, I think has kind of his finger on the pulse here pretty well, just in that if the portal's had a quote unquote parity effect, sure hasn't been in the G5. G5's getting fleeced right now.
Yes,
with the number of players that are leaving there, and it stinks. What I said, I think in my returning production piece, we either care or we don't. I sure wish we cared, but it doesn't seem like we care. But what it has definitely meant is the Texas A&Ms of the world, the teams that have just been a couple steps behind the absolutely elite for a while now, they've got a new tool to use. Ole Miss was, per SP Plus, the second best team in the country last year. That's how much upside they showed in their wins. Not just beating Georgia, but pummeling them, pummeling South Carolina.
Your colleague Nick Saban was into Ole Miss last year.
I think second best team certainly made me a little queasy, but I thought they were absolutely one of the 5 best teams in the country.
Yeah.
And that was because of the transfer portal. He signs 4-star freshmen here and there, but it was because of his work in the portal, his commitment to the portal. That worked great for him. So I don't really like his haul quite as much this year, I don't think. And I don't see them as being quite as good, but that's exactly the thing. Like, they were able to close a healthy percentage of the gap with the teams they never could close the gap on because of the portal. So I think that's basically what we're looking at here. There's just an extra thing that teams have to be good at. It's Georgia hadn't been all that great at the portal, and it's probably made them a little. It was certainly the least scary Georgia team in 3 or 4 years last year. It brought them back down to earth. They're going to start this year, a mere 4th in the rankings. But then it has allowed all these other teams to, if they're good at it, they can find a way into the picture a little bit. We'll see. LSU obviously is kind of trying to go for it this year. We'll see if they're good enough at it, but I certainly like how their defense is shaping up so far.
Bill, before we go head to head in Missouri trivia,
I'm scared.
Can you point to one team that you have to scroll pretty far down outside the top 50 in returning production, that you look at them and you still say, I think that's the team that we're going to be seeing in the playoff?
Well, Ohio State's 101st in returning production. I think that was pretty...
Outside of Ohio State.
No, Ohio State. Kind of cheating, I think. Let's see. I think Oregon was 110th, which I didn't expect. It makes sense.
That is surprising.
once I see it, it makes sense. You know, they did lose. I mean, well, they lost quite a bit once you look at it. But in my head, they've been recruiting well enough. They had enough guys coming back that we know of. You know, whether it's Evan Stewart, whether it's all those awesome linebackers and whatnot. But then you look at it again, and they have like one DB coming back. Like it's going to be all transfers maybe in the starting lineup. But they got one of the best players in the country through the portal in Thieneman from Purdue, but it's still a new guy. Defensive line's going to be pretty new. Offensive line's going to be pretty new. That added up quite a bit. I think I'm still just going to I'm rolling with Landon. I'm going to trust Landon until he gives me a reason not to. But that one really was like, once I actually looked at their roster, like, man, this is a lot newer team than I thought we were going to be playing with here. And Texas is another one. You know, in Arch we trust, I guess, but they're 103rd. They do. Linebackers are going to be awesome. Running backs are going to be awesome. A lot of turnover everywhere else, and we'll see exactly how they account for that.
Oregon also had the most productive quarterback maybe in the history of college football because he played for so long. So that too.